All right, we're at the top of page 17. I don't know what we're doing there, but that's where we are. We were dealing with sanctions last week. Sometimes you might wonder why it is that we can be assured of receiving a reward for a life well led. And the top paragraph on page 17 addresses that, because we're in the curious position that God doesn't owe us anything. You have to realize, if you'll forgive me going back to metaphysics for a second, that God is all perfect. God already possesses everything that he needs. God actually does not and cannot act for an end outside himself. Were he to do that, he would be seeking something which is less than himself, and that's impossible. So when God creates, it is not directly for our benefit, but to manifest his own glory, which is his eternal choice. Didn't have to do it. We don't add a thing to him. We don't make him more perfect by being more perfect ourselves. Any perfections that we possess, he already has. So, and more too, he doesn't owe us anything. He's given us our very being and our very lives. So in what sense can we properly expect a reward at the end of a life well lived? And that's what this little note here addresses. It says merit is condign. I love that word because I've never seen it before. It means deserved. I put deserved in there because I knew I'd forget what it meant. Merit is condign for man who obeys natural law. Why? A, God has given to us a natural urge for happiness. B, he has imposed upon us, through natural law, an obligation to act towards that last end. Which last end? Happiness. And C, man can fulfill that obligation freely by his free choices while living. Now, this doesn't mean that God is obliged to give us anything. But what it does mean is that in setting our existence up in this fashion, there is, as it says here, an implicit promise of a reward by God, which is not based on the justice of God, because God doesn't owe us anything, but rather on God's fidelity. In other words, that he will keep his own word. He has established a system for our salvation, and being true to himself and true to our nature, which he has created, that nature will, if properly used, attain its last end, which is our happiness, and which reflects the glory of God manifested either by the just reward of eternal happiness with him in heaven, or is also manifested by his justice for those who are eternally separated from him in that other place. The glory of God that we talk about, which is man's perfection, adds nothing to God, but it does give to man his last end, which is beatitude, perfect happiness, as perfect as human nature can have it. Now, mind you, you always think, well, am I going to have infinite happiness if I attain my last end in heaven? No, you're not going to have infinite happiness, but you'll have as complete happiness as your nature permits and as your life permits. We are not God. Everybody gets his own just deserts. I know, I remember they always used to use the example when I was a kid about everybody having glasses that are of different sizes, and you'll get filled to the size of your glass. And there certainly is a truth to that. What we're talking about, first of all, is the potency, which is human nature. Human nature can be completely fulfilled, but only to the extent of our finite being. And secondly, our perfection or happiness that we attain in God is also measured by the capacity for that which we have developed by the life of virtue that we live in this life. And I realize many people would say, how can this be ethics? You're talking about an afterlife. But we know from natural reasoning that man's ethical fulfillment is not completed in this life. It has to be completed in another life, the world to come, for us, because it cannot be completed in this life for many obvious reasons. So, okay, what do we have to do then to deserve this final reward? To begin to understand that, we're going to look at, first of all, from the subjective standpoint, human nature as a seat of virtue. And we're going to look at the things that pertain to how we are fitted to act as ethical beings. At a later point in the class, we will concern ourselves with the objective content of ethics as to what kinds of actions are appropriate to our nature and what are not. But to begin with, we have to get some understanding of how we operate as ethical beings. How do we make decisions? What conditions are our mode of behavior with respect to good and evil? And the first thing we have to understand is that we are creatures of habit. And that's why you need philosophical psychology before you take ethics. In Phil Psych, we learned what a habit is. What was it? A more or less permanent disposition to act in a certain way. And because we are creatures of habit, just maybe I should review it just for a second, because we are creatures of habit, this conditions the way that we operate. We are not born capable of doing everything that we do as adults. One of the first things that we had to learn was things like how to eat and how to walk. And we developed these abilities as what we call habits. If you don't have a habit, you have to learn something from scratch. If you didn't have the habit of walking, when you were done here, you'd stand up and you'd have to start trying to figure out, now, which foot do I put in front of which foot? And how do I do this? When you were a little kid, you spent a lot of time playing. Your playing was your job at the time to learn how to do marvelous things like drinking out of a cup without spilling the contents all over yourself. You began by spilling the contents all over yourself many times. Your mother or father, with great patience, assisted you to make sure that you didn't drown in the process. But over time, you learn how to do this. This isn't an easy thing. One of the biggest challenges we've had with robots is teaching them how to do something like drink a glass of water. It's far easier to teach them how to use a paint gun to spray the panel of the side of the door, but to teach them how to pick up a glass of water and actually drink from it. You know how difficult it is for children or for people who are suffering from some kind of palsy. It's almost impossible. We do it regularly, except on the few times that we drown ourselves and choke to death. But by and large, we do this very well because we have developed the habit through repetition. By repeating the acts, we perfect the sequence of motor operations, motor skills that enable us to do this. Well, we have all kinds of habits. And because we are creatures of habit, it enables us to live life more easily. If you had to every day start out over again learning how to walk and talk and eat, you wouldn't get very far, would you? That's what you did when you were a child. When you were playing as a child, you were learning all the basic laws of physics in reference to your body and how it interacts with the environment. And learning how to do it very well. So now you don't have to worry about it. It's automatic. Habits put us on autopilot in reference to all sorts of things, just like when you learned how to drive a car. Now you get in the car and you just think about, where am I going? And by and large, everything's automatic. So We learn in philosophical psychology that we are creatures of habit. Habits make it easy to operate in a certain way. But notice the definition: a more or less permanent disposition to act in a certain way. But we say in a certain way, that isn't always in a good way. If we have learned bad habits, we carry them through life. Some of us, all we have to do is look down at our handwriting and we know what it is to have a bad habit. Having corrected students' papers for more than 40 years, I can tell you there are amazing differences in the habits of people, and anybody who says the two sexes are the same is insane. All you gotta do is look at male handwriting compared to female handwriting. I do not know why, but by and large, the female handwriting, or even, I guess they have a kind of cursive printing today, it usually is pretty, pleasing to the eye. But in many instances, or most instances, the male handwriting is simply obscene. I don't know how else to describe it. Now, these are all habits. They are learned. And that's why when I was a little kid, they used to make us learn the Palmer penmanship method, where you'd make circles and so forth forever. And then some theoretician came along and said it doesn't have anything to do with how you write. And of course today, they've come to the genius conclusion that we no longer even need to learn cursive because we have computers. So we're going to wind up with a generation of people that can't write their own names, which of course is where they started in the first place. So, but again, we are creatures of habit. We develop these habits. They're easy. They take a long time to form usually, although some are formed quickly. They take a long time to change. They take a long time to, if you got a bad habit, it's difficult to break it. You have to break it by repetition. I'm going to give you an example that I gave in the Phil Psych course, but I think it's too good to forget. When you're trying to change a habit, it's like I had an aunt who was worked in a bank, and she took me when I was about 8 years old back to the big safe door. And this thing weighed 25 tons or something. And she said, try to move it. I couldn't move it, of course. It's just sitting there. If you try real hard, it doesn't move. But she said, just put a couple fingers on it and just keep pressure on it. And as you do that, because it's so perfectly balanced, it starts moving ever so slowly with increasing speed as you go. Now, if you try to stop it, put your hand up against it, you can't. It just pushes your hand right backwards, because it has this tremendous mass and inertia and momentum that you just can't turn it around quickly. But you do turn it around by applying the contrary force, even gently, and just waiting, and slowly it will reverse. Habits are like that. They're an internal inertia or momentum within our very behavior. It may be physical behavior, it may be mental behavior, it may be moral behavior. But it's an inertia, it's a force that drives us in a certain direction, and it's very difficult once it's been formed in that direction to reverse it. Reversing it is hard. It takes time. It takes repeated contradictory effort. So if you're used to overeating, as we all know how hard it is to reverse the process. But if you do perform acts that contradict the direction of a habit, and you do it often enough, you will eventually develop the contradictory habit. So if you're tending towards gluttony, you may learn to tend towards self-control with respect to food. And it will become easier and easier the more that you do it. So that is the relevance of this to ethics. We have habits, and habits that pertain to the moral life, but they pertain to all of our life, and that's why the moral life interacts with all the rest of the habits that we already have. So if somebody has a tremendous disposition physically, biologically, towards drinking excessive alcohol, he may try to refrain from this and change his moral behavior, but his physiology is already oriented tremendously in this direction, and perhaps without outside assistance, he may not be able to stop this. So this is, of course, also the reason, the categorical reason, to raise children with good habits. It makes it easier for them to lead virtuous lives. You're doing them a favor not to let them develop bad habits. So a habit is a more or less permanent acquired disposition. It's not things you're born with. It's things that you learn over time. To act in a certain way. It presupposes the freedom, the capability of forming such dispositions. It is sometimes called second nature. The reason being, we're born with our first nature, the things that are just automatic. When you, as a child, you open your eyes and you see. You open your mouth and you make noise. But it takes time to make that noise sound like words or to sound like beautiful singing. See, that's the different, those things, once you learn, for example, how to speak, it becomes second nature. All of us in here speak English. Second nature to us. We weren't born able to do it, but now we do it without even trying or without even thinking. Unfortunately, sometimes people will get brain injuries where they have to learn it all over again. Although usually they don't learn it all over again, but rather they reacquire in a rapid fashion that which they've lost, hopefully. Sometimes they never do. But that's why we talk about it as a second nature. Because it's easy. It's just like when you learn how to ride a bicycle. First time you ride a bike, you get killed. Right? And yet it's amazing. You give a kid a bike, and after 1 day or 2 days, all of a sudden they get the knack of it, and they're racing all over the place, and, no hands on the handlebars, everything. They can do anything. It's second nature to them now. When they began it, they couldn't even see how they were going to do it. You'd say, I can't do it, it's impossible. But that's how we put one nature on top of the other. We're born with our own nature. Habits are second nature to us. Virtue is a good operative habit. Operative habit is a habit that enables us to do something. Good operative habit is a virtue. A bad operative habit is a vice. Now, some people's handwriting is vicious. To go back to my prior example. That is a vice. Notice we have to distinguish between moral vices and other vices. There are many habits we have that are vices, but they're not moral vices. Bad handwriting is not normally a moral vice, but it is a vice. Not riding the bicycle well is a vice, but it's not a moral vice. Our concern in ethics, of course, has to do with moral virtue and moral vice. Habits make actions easy to perform. They are the product of repetition. And that's why somebody trying to learn how to play the piano has to play it again and again and again and again and again till he gets it right, till his fingers develop the motor habits to move in the right sequence in order to produce the correct sound. Virtue, moral virtue, produces nobility of character. When you talk about somebody having a good character, what you mean is they have a integrated, holistic grouping of all the major virtues, moral virtues. That's what a good character is. One minor aside here, you may have heard that Plato at one time said that knowledge is virtue. He did say that. Knowledge is virtue. Which means that if you know the right thing, you'll do it. Now, if there's anything we as human beings know, it's that many times we know what we should do and we just don't. We know what we shouldn't do, but we do it anyway. That's the human condition of sinfulness. So how could somebody as brilliant as Plato have made such a stupid statement as to say knowledge is virtue? If you know what is right, you'll do it. In fact, This is also referred to as the Socratic fallacy. Now you might say, how come Plato made the mistake and we blame Socrates? Well, that's because Socrates is the character, the real character, in Plato's dialogues. So as far as the teaching is concerned, it's very difficult to tell what Socrates was saying from what Plato was saying. I'll leave that to the historians. But the Socratic fallacy is the idea that knowledge is virtue. How could Plato have said such a thing? Anybody know? You know he wasn't stupid. Let's put it this way, if you knew with absolute certitude that a certain action would lead you to your immediate beheading, would you do it? I don't think so. I mean, if you really knew that. What Socrates was getting at, what Plato was getting at, was for the person who has perfect clarity of knowledge, episteme, certitude of the relationship between his choices and his last end, such a person would never do anything wrong. His knowledge would assure his virtue. Now, of course, the problem is, in this life, given the reality of original sin, none of us have that kind of knowledge. We can always deceive ourselves, or maybe someone will help us to be deceived, so that we don't see clearly the relationship between this immediate action and our last end. If you were to go into a bank to rob a bank and you knew with certitude that there was a guard standing there with a gun and you'd have a bullet between your eyes before you opened your mouth, would you rob the bank? Of course not. But the bank robber goes in with a presumption that he's going to get away with it, that he'll go off and enjoy his ill-gotten goods in the Bahamas, and nothing bad's going to happen. If he knew for sure that his action was equivalent to roasting in hell for all eternity and had a very vivid imagination as to what that entailed, I think he might think twice about robbing the bank. That kind of knowledge, that kind of clarity of knowledge, epistemic certitude, we just don't have in this world, in this life. But that's what Plato and Socrates were talking about. They're talking about the philosopher assuming that he has perfect knowledge, and therefore they were not dumb to have said this. It's just that they were speaking in ideal terms that we know in human life and human nature we are not experiencing, however that happened to have come about. All right, let's take a look at some of the virtues. There are a group here of 6 intellectual virtues. Of course, what this presupposes is that we understand from philosophical psychology that we have an intellect, and that the intellect is a power of the human soul. And the intellect is the ability to understand, it's the ability to judge, it's the ability to reason. And that it is having an intellect that marks us as separate from the rest of the animal kingdom. We are the only creatures in this world, physical creatures, capable of understanding, judging, and reasoning. And therefore, these powers to do this have within them the capacity to be perfected, the capacity to be developed. And therefore, they are qualities of the intellect that we're talking about here, which are specified by different formal objects. That is to say, there are differences in the ways that we use the intellect to specify these different virtues. They are divided into the speculative and the practical. And in the speculative, we have wisdom, science, and nous, or understanding. Wisdom, which is the highest of, the speculative intellectual virtues are those that are concerned with knowledge for its own sake. Remember the difference between the speculative and the practical. Speculative is knowledge for its own sake. Practical is knowledge for the useful knowledge, knowledge for the sake of something else. The speculative knowledge, which we call wisdom, pertains to the ultimate knowledge, the ultimate explanation of things. Who do we call the wise person? Now, you may have a mechanic who is fantastic at fixing your car. Does that make him a wise man? Not necessarily. You may have a lawyer that is incredibly clever, but he may not be terribly wise. In fact, it's possible for somebody to be a genius at certain capabilities, but in terms of being able to live as a good life, may be just terrible at it. May be an incredibly good computer hacker and wind up in jail for 20 years. That's not wisdom. As a wise person would not put himself in that position. Wisdom, when we talk about somebody who's wise, you're talking about somebody who has a good grasp of everything that really matters, the things that really matter in life, and ultimately somebody you could go to and say, what's the explanation of this, and what's the explanation of that explanation, and indeed, what is the ultimate explanation of everything? That old stupid question people ask you at 3 a.m. when you're 3 sheets to the wind and falling off a bar stool. They ask you, what is the meaning of life? And you're having enough trouble just balancing. Wisdom pertains to the ultimate answers to the ultimate questions, and that really means metaphysics. Metaphysics, because if you pursue the explanations, for example, of the physical world, you learn all about the sciences of astronomy and biology and chemistry, and you also learn, when you pursue them a little bit further, that they ultimately reduce to physics. That's why the physicists are walking around so proud, because they know ultimately everything reduces to their field. But then when you look at the laws of physics and try to understand them, and you start asking, why are the laws as they are? They had some wonderful programs the last couple nights on PBS. They do have some good programs. Dealing with the cosmos and the meaning of time and the search for the ultimate theories to explain the physical universe, culminating finally in string theory, which is the latest, I don't want to say fad, but it's the latest speculation. But you see, the difficulty is, for the physicists, there still is a deeper question. And that is, we come to know how things are, but why are they that way? Why do they exist at all? Why does the universe exist at all? Even Stephen Hawking raises that question. He recognizes the question, but unfortunately not the answer. There is a deeper question. I had a course at the University of Notre Dame from Professor Charles de Koninck, which was focused on all of the scientists, all the great scientists of our time, and Einstein and Oppenheimer, de Broglie and Bohr, all of these, Heisenberg, all of these people. And one of the key themes that he was making throughout the entire course is that at a certain point in their life, they became dissatisfied simply with physics and wanted to go beyond it and try to get a more general explanation of things. And this drove them into philosophy. Einstein wound up as a quasi-Platonist of sorts. He wound up with a conception of God that was akin to that of Spinoza. There is a innate drive within the human mind that the more that we pursue the understanding of things, the more we are driven to ultimate explanations, and that ultimately, for one who does not fall into the pit of materialism, drives one beyond this world to spiritual explanations and properly using the intellect to the first cause uncaused, which is God. And thus the science of metaphysics is wisdom. It is the science which ultimately leads us to the first cause uncaused, the cause of all things that we see in this world, the ultimate explanation of everything. Because after all, even if you understood everything there is to understand about physics, there is ultimately a radical givenness. There is a point beyond which you can only say, that's just the way it is. And it is. It exists. And either it has to explain itself, which finite being cannot do. That's the point of the proofs for God's existence, to show that finite being does not explain itself. Or the mind must transcend the limiting conditions of time and space and realize that this basic givenness of physical laws arises from a metaphysical source, a source beyond physics, a source beyond any limited, constricted, finite space-time continuum, a transcendent reality which itself is non-material and utterly unchanging and eternal. And physics doesn't explain itself. And that's what we mean by wisdom, knowledge of the ultimate causes in the natural order, metaphysics, in the revealed order, what we call sacred theology. Sacred theology proposing truths known through revelation, which the mind operating naturally cannot attain, but which do not conflict with or contradict the things that are known by reason. Remember, reason and faith do not contradict each other. Faith, adequately understood, genuinely revealed, must be consonant with natural reason. Reality cannot contradict itself. So this is the intellectual virtue known as wisdom. Obviously, not everybody possesses it equally. And some people, one suspects, possesses it not at all. Science. Scientia, certain knowledge through causes. Just as one, I would dare say with respect to any of these, remember their habits. The longer that you think about these ultimate explanations of things, the easier it is to do and the more that you understand. I have to remember, I do have the advantage over some of you that I actually have taught metaphysics for 40 years. And very few people are blessed with the opportunity to do this. I'm not saying, hey, I'm brilliant. What I'm telling you is I've spent so much time thinking about this material that it has, to some extent, become second nature to me. So it becomes easy to do it. Easier than for, I know it must be, easier than for my incoming students in my metaphysics courses who are sitting there saying, what is this all about? See, just by doing it a long time and thinking about it, the more that you think about it, the easier it gets. So it is a habit. Science is the same thing. Now, what we mean by science here is certain knowledge through causes. This doesn't mean experimental science as we normally take it today. What it refers to is science as it was defined by Aristotle. Science meaning true knowledge. When do you have true knowledge? When do you have certain knowledge? He says to have real knowledge, you have to know that something is true, why it is true, and why it cannot be otherwise. That's very rigorous requirements. It is exemplified at its highest level in what he refers to as the scientific syllogism, which is a deductive demonstration from premises that are certainly known, either because they are self-evident or immediately evident, and from which we deduce through valid inference, solid logic, a conclusion that necessarily follows from the premises and is known with certitude for the same reason that we know that the premises are known with certitude. This is a very high, rigorous definition of science. It is not to be confused with the kind of inductive reasoning that we find in contemporary modern science, which causes a great deal of confusion in people. You talk to the average person. I have to kind of readjust and think of where most people are. You talk to the average person and they'll say, well, if I want to know something for sure, I go to a scientist, because they really know how things are. They can tell you exactly and precisely what things are. And if I want to, if I talk to a philosopher, this is somebody who's all confused. Somebody who's got a million different theories, doesn't really know up from down, and still is trying to debate how many angels dance on the head of a pin. This is the kind of confused, inverted thinking you find in people today, because the truth, of course, is quite opposite. It's just the reverse. It is the scientist who doesn't really know anything for sure. And it is only in philosophy, ultimately in metaphysics, that you can attain apodictic certitude. See, the reality is just on top, upside down. Natural science can't even decide or agree completely on whether the inductive method is the inductive method. I was just reading Karl Popper today, and he's basically saying that the method of induction is irrelevant to science, but try to tell that to most scientists. But then the inductive method, what are you doing? You're looking at individual observations of individual phenomena. And you make repeated observations and from it try to generalize a theory or hypothesis, which you then test with a critical experiment, and from that try to support or put forth and maybe support a theory, which if it's universally accepted eventually becomes what they call a law. The difficulty, though, is that there's an inherent fallacy in the experimental method. I need my board, but since we're recording this anyway, I don't have a board. Because you see, the experimental method, I'm trying to remember, the logic of it is CCPQ, CPQ. What's saying is, if I come up with a hypothesis, for example, I conclude that if it rains, the grass will get wet. That's my hypothesis, that the rain causes the grass to get wet. So I go out and observe. Now this isn't really an experiment, but I go out and observe the grass is wet, and then I notice it's been raining. So I conclude my hypothesis is correct. Of course, the difficulty is that somebody could have been out there with a garden hose making the grass wet. You can't, in other words, if my hypothesis is correct, I run this experiment, and the experiment is supposed to demonstrate my hypothesis. The problem with the experiment is you can get the same result from diverse causes. And that's why you don't really have certitude. When an experiment goes right, all the scientist can say is the results of my experiment tend to confirm my hypothesis. That's all he can say. He can't say that it proves my hypothesis correct. And unfortunately, he never can say it proves it's correct, because no matter how many observations you make, it only takes one contradictory observation to destroy your hypothesis or your theory. And this has been remarked multiple times, even by Stephen Hawking. I have to quote some great authority here, so I'll quote Hawking. The inductive method is itself a logical fallacy. There is no way you can go from the particular to the universal. It ultimately comes to a good guess, which approximates previous observation. Isaac Newton's Newtonian laws were an amazingly good guess. and verified repeatedly, endlessly, by scientific experiments until the time of Einstein and relativity theory, when we slowly began to find out that at very high velocities and at great distances in space, Newton's laws don't perfectly describe physical phenomena, but rather relativity theory appears to do so. So even though we had all these centuries of verification of the Newtonian laws, ultimately it turns out they were a very good descriptive guess, but they aren't right, at least according to the later theory of Einstein. And in fact, any good scientist will tell you, well, they never are right because we constantly have to keep adjusting them more and more. So people should not confuse precision with certitude. In fact, you shouldn't confuse precision with being right at all. A scientist can calculate where an asteroid will be 30 years from now, and he can tell you where it will be down to the last foot based on present observations. He can tell you down to 16 decimal places beyond the last foot. It can be an incredibly precise prediction, but it could also be 30 million miles off when you get there, because precision isn't the same thing as being right. Precision just means you've got a very well marked out calculation, very close calculation, but it's not the same thing as being right. The asteroid could have been picked up by the gravity of Jupiter and sent off some other place. Utterly. Just doesn't do what we expect at all. So natural science doesn't give us that kind of certitude. But philosophical science can. But it requires, again, a great deal of study, a great deal of practice. The demonstration for God's existence, for example, that belongs to wisdom, uses principles that are derived from metaphysical science. And metaphysical science uses certain first principles, such as that being cannot both be and not be, that nothing that is in motion is capable of moving itself. It needs some kind of external mover, and if that external mover itself be moved, then something else must move it. These truths can be known with certitude. Newton tells us that a body in motion tends to remain in motion. I don't deny that, but the difficulty is that that is simply a description. It's an observation of how bodies in the physical world appear to behave, but it doesn't explain why they do it. And curiously enough, Newton himself, in his optics, makes the observation that a body in motion, say you take a stone in outer space and throw it, like a planet going through space, we say, well, why does it keep going? We say, well, because of the second law of thermodynamics. Body in motion tends to remain in motion. Yes, but why? Why? You're just telling me it doesn't, but you're not explaining why. Newton himself in his optics said that for this to happen, there has to be a force that is operative upon that body to keep it making progress through space. Newton said that. Modern physicists don't say it, but the guy who invented the principle said it. And he was right, but you wouldn't know it from natural science. You know it only from cosmology and metaphysics. That's another story. That belongs to the analysis of the secunda via, the second way of St. Thomas's proving God's existence. Anyway, we only got to science. Let's go on to intelligence here. Nous, understanding. First principles. Think about being. The first principles of being, of metaphysics, identity, non-contradiction, sufficient reason, causality, finality. You know them when you study metaphysics because they're the starting point of metaphysics. They're the starting point of everything. These are principles that everybody knows, but not everybody understands that they are principles. But you have to think about them a lot. When you're doing metaphysics, you got to think about being. You got to eat, sleep, and drink being. All the time. The more you think about it, the easier it is to understand why these principles are as they are and why they cannot be otherwise. And when you're doing that, you are developing the habit of understanding. That's why it's an intellectual habit. We're not born as metaphysicians. We're not born to be able to think essentially. I had an old Latin professor at the University of Detroit that said something like 8 or 9 out of every 10 people can't even think essentially. If you're trying to think, if you're thinking essentially, you're doing something that only about 10 or 15% of the population can do. Isn't it amazing that democracy has worked at all? To think in terms of principle, not in terms of appearance. You don't vote for somebody because he's cute. You don't vote for somebody because he's very quick of tongue. Now, somebody may be so stupid that he can't remember 3 things. But he may not be able to think of 3 things at the same time, but you might be better off with somebody like that if they have very solid principles of social philosophy, rather than somebody who is extremely adept and glib of tongue, but who has wretched social philosophical principles. Who do you really want to govern you? You see?
I'm going to change my vote.
See, I always tell myself that's important because I never was that fast in terms of thinking things. There are a lot of people, they're able to instantaneously come right back at you. But the problem is, what's the content? I've never felt like I could really respond that quickly. I know you probably think I can, but what you don't understand is I've been doing this for over 40 years. When you do something over 40 years, even if you're bad at it, you get a little bit better than you were to begin with. That's why we have to be, not too quick to judge when somebody has intrinsic value. And that's what you got to watch with these politicians. Don't be overwhelmed by somebody who just, they're just fantastic on their feet. But when you're talking about the governance of a country, you want somebody who's stable on his feet and who maybe doesn't react instantaneously. You'll have to figure out who that is yourselves. The practical virtues. Here we have 3. Again, synderesis, prudence, and art. A practical virtues have to do with producing something. They are a means to an end. They're not just something you have for its own understanding in itself. And what we're particularly concerned with them producing, as far as ethics is concerned, are the habits that produce a good life, produce a virtuous person, produce a good character. That's what we're trying to produce. You can go produce all the cars you want and all the fine watches you want. That doesn't make you a good person. And somebody might be very bad at making automobiles, but they may be a very virtuous person. Always have to remember that. Synderesis. It's a mouthful. These are the first principles of the practical order, habitually understood, and primarily the first of all is do good and avoid evil, which is nothing but, in the ethical order, the principle of being. Seek being, avoid non-being. Being as desirable is the good. So we are built by our very nature as beings to affirm being in ourselves and to seek being from others and in others. We are built to seek the good. You don't have to tell somebody, do good and avoid evil. You know, go out there and have people put their hands up. How many of you are seeking evil today? You know, so don't be much, yeah, I'm seeking evil. Well, they're not liable to be saying that. And if they say it, even when they say they're seeking evil, they're seeking something good about it. And even the worst of evils has something good about it, because if it were utterly evil, it'd be nothing, would it? It'd be non-being. There'd be nothing desirable. In fact, some of the greatest evils are evil precisely because they're very desirable, which means there's something very good about them. I mean, we see, Edwin.
You said before that being is not necessarily good because being may be enduring misery.
Did I say being is not necessarily good? I hope I didn't say that. Being is necessarily good. Being in reference to something else may not be good. For example, it's good for the mosquito to bite you and draw the blood out of you, but it's not good for you. The mosquito's having its lunch, you just don't like what's on the menu. So every agent is seeking a good, always seeking a good.
I brought up the argument that many principles that we consider ethical can be proven on natural grounds in that they promote being and existence. And you rebuttal by saying that being can sometimes be miserable. For some person, someone existence is actually pure misery, and it's not a good in and of itself.
Well, I hope I didn't put it that way. If I did, I'll perjure myself, because I don't want to say that evil is not good, but what I want to recognize is that one thing may be evil relative to another. And some people, for example, even abjure existence itself by committing suicide, but they do so because they perceive it to be a greater evil to continue to live and suffer than what they think to be the nirvana of nothingness. So they're still seeking a kind of good from their perspective, which is the avoidance of this particular evil. So we're always seeking good. Everything's always seeking good, and we live in a universe of goods, a universe of beings. It's just the conflict between these beings which gives rise to evil. It's just like you've seen those ads where there's no such thing as a free lunch, where you see one little fish being eaten by a bigger fish, being eaten by a bigger fish, being eaten by a bigger fish. They're all seeking goods, but the big fish relative to the little fish is an evil from the standpoint of the little fish. A little fish would be happy just to keep swimming. So yes, we live in a very complex world, and it's the interaction of beings which gives rise to, in a per accidens way, much of what we call evil. And you can't, if you're going to have a physical universe, that's part of the problem of evil. If you have a physical universe, you're going to have a lot of finite beings that are interacting with each other, and when they interact with each other, what is good for one may be bad for another. And
so is being better than non-being?
Absolutely.
So therefore, we can justify certain ethical principles, not without alluding to the existence of God, but because they promote being and existence.
Well,
preservation of civilization, for instance.
Well, when I say being is better than non-being, remember, I'm saying it in the context of a metaphysics in which I know that God exists, in which I understand that God is the absolute being and the absolute good. So if you were to truncate your metaphysics and get rid of God, you suddenly get into a very different kind of world, a world in which there is no ultimate responsibility for your actions because you're answerable to no one. And therefore, the very basis for needing to do what is right or good is gone. So when I answer your questions, I'm always answering it within the context of the complete metaphysics. If you take, and what people do oftentimes to get a kind of perverted ethic is they pull out part of the picture and try to look at just that part and focus on it alone. And when you do that, you have disoriented that part from the whole. The whole always has to start with the fact, ultimately, that there is a God creating the world, and that all finite beings pursue good as they are ultimately aimed at the God for which created them and made them good in the first place. So I guess the difficulty I'd have with what you're saying is that I would say that it's referring to a partial picture. In a complete picture, everything will fit. But if you just abstract a portion of it, I'll grant you, maybe things don't work. I can't put an absolute. I said yes, we must seek the good, we must seek being, but I wouldn't say that with absolute certitude in a world that prescinds from God. A world that prescinds from God is unintelligible anyway, because the whole point of the proofs for God's existence is that such a world doesn't explain itself. To understand it completely, you have to posit God's existence. And therefore, the question you raise is an unanswerable question because it has been abstracted from reality. Reality always has God at the top of it. So I would say we always seek the good, we always seek being, but it must be understood that the ultimate basis for that drive is the existence of the Supreme Being. And absent that, it would be like trying to understand the solar system while having removed the sun. It wouldn't work too well for very long. We'd all be going our separate ways as planets off into the abyss. All right, synderesis. Do good and avoid evil. Of course, how to do good, how to avoid evil, that brings us to prudence. Prudence is right reason about things to be done here and now. I think that we actually take a closer look at prudence at a later time, so I'm not going to go into it too far, but consider art and prudence together. Prudence is right reason about things to be done. Art is right reason about things to be made. Becoming a good person is a work of art. Because that's what you're doing. You're engaging in those acts that will produce a person of good character, which is what the ultimate measure of a good human being is. We're not a good person because we're a good fireman, or we're not a good person because we're a great neurosurgeon. There are people that have, they've been, Hitler was a halfway decent painter, but I don't think we would call him a good person. So prudence applies synderesis. In other words, synderesis says do good and avoid evil. Prudence tells me how to do it. Here and now. And that, always remember that somebody may be extremely brilliant, extremely intelligent, but they may be very imprudent. Speaking of Albert Einstein, I recall in 1955, he was in the hospital trying to make up his mind whether to have an operation when he died. He didn't decide fast enough. Now, certainly he wasn't a dumb man, was he? But you still have to know what to do. And sometimes people who are not the most brilliant in the world still have a great deal of prudence. And we seek out prudent people. They help us to get out of trouble. I'm in trouble. Tell me what to do. Now, you may not know everything in the world, but you may have enough life experience and enough practical experience and enough understanding of human nature that you can give me guidance, which I need. I may know all about theoretical physics, but my life may be a mess. And you do see this in many people. They're outstanding civil servants, but their personal lives are horrific. They're a mess. They've been married 14 times. And we say, well, how on earth can they function? Well, they do, because it's something else. But in terms of making their own life successful, they lack the prudence required to do it. They may have a practical prudence within their own field of expertise. You see, a neurosurgeon may be fantastic at knowing just how to do surgery on your brain. but he may have a terrible family that he contributes to because he's so imprudent in dealing with them. See how complex we are as human beings. What ethics repeatedly reminds us, though, is that we must focus upon what is most important as a human being, living our lives day to day in reference to our last end. And prudence keeps our eye on the ball. It says, you may earn $100,000 or $1 million, but you're not going to take it with you. So how are you going to live? You may earn all this money by doing things that are unethical. Is it really worth it? The imprudent person says, yeah, it's worth it. I'm doing great. IRS hasn't even caught up with me. But the prudent person says, wait a minute, I'm missing the point of life. When you reach a certain age and somebody says, I'm going to show you how you can make $1 million, just invest your money with me and spend your time doing this. Frankly, you reach a point where you're too old to care. You know you're not going to have the time to spend it all unless you're like Uncle Scrooge McDuck and just want to play with it in your vault. Immediate experience. Art is in the intellect. And that's why I know of one artist who had a stroke. He was a good artist. Painted with his right hand. He had a stroke. And you know what he did? He trained himself to use his left hand so he could paint better than he could with his right hand. Because his art wasn't in the hand, it was in his mind. So art is a habit of the intellect, primarily. Secondarily, it's in the hand. It's in the limbs, whereby we train them to have the motor operative skills to execute what the mind understands. That's why it's in the limbs per accidens, incidentally. Okay, I think we've done all we can for tonight. Thank you.
Sound production copyright Olteen Library Services 2013. All rights reserved. www.aquinasphilosophy.com